Baby saw a bear. Cub trapped in a playground tunnel. What he did next was pure bravery. The morning mist hung low over the empty playground, making everything look like it was floating in a dream. Lily Morgan pushed the stroller slowly along the gravel path, her 10-month-old son Jacob babbling softly in the early morning quiet. The park was completely empty at this hour, just the way she liked it. The swings hung perfectly still, their chains covered in tiny droplets of dew that looked like diamonds in the weak sunlight. She had been coming here every morning for the past 3 months, ever since Jacob had started crawling. It was their special time, just the two of them, before the world woke up and filled the space with noise and chaos. The air smelled like wet grass and pine trees, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the soft gurgle of the creek that ran along the edge of the park. Jacob suddenly stopped babbling and went completely silent. His tiny hands gripped the edge of the stroller, and his whole body tensed up like he was listening to something she couldn't hear. She stopped pushing and looked down at him, noticing how his eyes were fixed on something ahead. Following his gaze, she saw the playground tunnel, one of those plastic tubes that connected 2 parts of the jungle gym. It was bright yellow and green, standing out against the gray morning like a strange beacon. Nothing seemed unusual about it at first glance, but Jacob was staring at it with an intensity she had never seen in him before. His breathing had changed too, becoming deeper and more deliberate, almost like he was preparing for something important. She unbuckled him from the stroller, thinking maybe he wanted to crawl through the tunnel like they had done yesterday. But the moment his feet touched the ground, he started moving toward it with a purpose that made her heart skip a beat. He wasn't crawling in his usual playful way, with stops and starts to examine leaves or rocks. He was moving straight and steady, like something was pulling him forward. The closer they got to the tunnel, the more wrong everything felt. The morning birds that usually filled the air with their songs had gone completely quiet. Even the creek seemed to have stopped its babbling, leaving only a thick, heavy silence that pressed against her ears. Jacob reached the entrance of the tunnel and paused, his tiny hand resting on the edge of the plastic opening. She could see his chest rising and falling rapidly, and for a moment she thought he might turn back. But then he made a sound she had never heard him make before, a soft, almost musical humming that seemed to echo inside the tunnel. The sound bounced back to them, but it came back different, deeper and sadder somehow. That's when she heard it too, a small, desperate, scratching sound coming from inside the tunnel, followed by the softest whimper she had ever heard. Her first instinct was to grab Jacob and run. Every motherly instinct in her body was screaming danger, telling her to get her baby away from whatever was in that tunnel. But Jacob had already started crawling inside, and the way he moved, so calm and determined, made her freeze. She dropped to her knees at the entrance, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The tunnel was about 6 feet long, and through the dim yellow plastic she could make out 2 shapes. One was Jacob, still crawling forward with that strange, steady rhythm. The other was something dark and furry, pressed against the far end of the tunnel. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the plastic, she realized what she was looking at. It was a bear cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, with one of its paws caught in a gap where 2 sections of the tunnel connected. The cub's eyes were wide with fear, and it was trembling all over. Its fur was matted with dew and dirt, and she could see where it had been struggling, leaving small scratches on the inside of the plastic. But what struck her most was how still it became when Jacob approached. The cub stopped struggling, stopped whimpering, and just watched as this tiny human baby crawled closer. Jacob reached out his chubby little hand, and she wanted to scream, wanted to dive into the tunnel and pull him back, but something held her in place. Maybe it was the way the cub's eyes softened, or maybe it was the complete absence of aggression in its body language. Jacob's hand touched the cub's trapped paw, and both creatures went completely still. The moment stretched out like a held breath, the whole world seeming to pause and watch what would happen next. Then Jacob did something that would stay with her forever. He started pulling at the plastic edge where the cub's paw was stuck, his tiny fingers working with a focus she didn't know a baby could have. The cub watched him, occasionally letting out small huffs that sounded almost like encouragement. She found herself crawling into the tunnel too, not to stop Jacob but to help him. Her hands were shaking as she reached past her son to feel where the paw was caught. The plastic had warped slightly, creating a gap just big enough for a curious cub to stick its paw through but not pull it back out. Working together, with Jacob's surprising determination and her adult strength, they managed to widen the gap just enough. The cub pulled its paw free with a soft pop, and for a moment, all three of them just stayed there in the yellow twilight of the tunnel. The cub looked at Jacob, and Jacob looked at the cub, and something passed between them that she couldn't quite understand. It was like watching two old friends reunite after a long separation, even though that was impossible. The cub reached out with its now free paw and gently touched Jacob's face, its claws carefully retracted. Jacob giggled, that pure, delighted sound that only babies can make, and the cub made a sound too, a soft rumbling that might have been its version of laughter. Then, as suddenly as the moment had begun, it ended. The cub turned and scrambled out the far end of the tunnel, pausing once to look back at them before disappearing into the bushes at the edge of the playground. She pulled Jacob against her chest, both of them still inside the tunnel, and tried to process what had just happened. That's when she heard it, a sound that made every hair on her body stand up. From somewhere deep in the woods beyond the playground came a long, mournful call. It wasn't quite a roar, and it wasn't quite a howl, but something in between that spoke of loss and searching. The mother bear was looking for her cub, and she was close, very close. She scrambled backward out of the tunnel, clutching Jacob tightly, her mind racing with the terrible possibilities of what could happen if the mother bear found them here. But Jacob wasn't afraid. He was looking toward the woods with that same intense focus, his little hand pointing in the direction of the sound. She started to run toward the stroller, but something made her stop and turn around. There, at the edge of the tree line, she saw them. The cub had found its mother, and they were both standing there, watching. The mother bear was massive, her dark fur gleaming in the morning light that had finally burned through the mist. She should have been terrifying, should have sent them running in panic, but there was something in her posture that held no threat. She was looking at them, really looking, and in her eyes was something that looked impossibly like gratitude. The cub was pressed against her side, and she could see it making small movements, almost like it was telling her what had happened. The mother bear took one step forward, then stopped, her massive head tilting slightly as she regarded them. Jacob waved, actually waved at the bear, and made that same musical humming sound he had made before. The mother bear's ears twitched, and she made a sound in response, a soft chuffing that carried across the space between them. Then, something extraordinary happened. The mother bear lowered her head in what looked like a bow, held it for a moment, then turned and walked back into the woods with her cub. They moved slowly, without fear or urgency, occasionally looking back until the forest swallowed them completely. She stood there holding Jacob, her legs shaking, her mind trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just the rescue of the cub, though that was remarkable enough. It was the communication, the understanding that had passed between her baby and those wild creatures. Jacob had shown no fear, only compassion and determination to help, and the bears, both mother and cub, had recognized something in him that she was only beginning to understand herself. As she walked back to the stroller, Jacob babbling happily again, as if nothing unusual had happened, she noticed something different about the playground. The birds had started singing again, but their songs seemed more deliberate, more meaningful. The creek's babbling sounded like words she couldn't quite make out. Even the morning light seemed different, warmer and more golden than before. She strapped Jacob back into the stroller, her hands still trembling slightly, and started pushing him along the path toward home. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that they had crossed some invisible line into a world where the boundaries between human and nature were not as solid as she had believed. Jacob fell asleep on the way home, his little face peaceful and content, one hand still stretched out as if reaching for something only he could see. That night, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She sat by Jacob's crib, watching him sleep, and wondered what other mysteries he might reveal as he grew. The rational part of her mind kept trying to explain it away, to find logical reasons for everything she had witnessed. But deep down, she knew that some things couldn't be explained by logic alone. Some things existed in that space between the known and unknown, between fear and wonder. She thought about telling her husband when he got back from his business trip, but how could she explain it? How could she make him understand that their baby had somehow communicated with a wild bear cub, that there had been a moment of pure understanding between species that should have been impossible? She decided to keep it as their secret, hers and Jacob's, at least for now. The next morning, she found herself back at the playground at the same early hour. She told herself she was just maintaining their routine, but she knew she was hoping to see them again. Jacob seemed to sense it too, his eyes scanning the tree line as she pushed him in the swing. They didn't see the bears that day, or the next, or the one after that. But something had changed in the park. Other animals seemed less afraid of them now. Squirrels would come closer, birds would land nearby and sing, and once a deer stepped out of the woods and watched them for a full minute before calmly walking away. It was as if word had spread somehow, as if the animal world had marked them as friends. Jacob always responded to these encounters with that same calm interest, never grabbing or chasing, just observing and occasionally making soft sounds that the animals seemed to understand. A week passed, then two, and she had almost convinced herself that the whole thing had been some kind of shared dream. But then, on a morning very much like that first one, with mist hanging low and the world still quiet, she found something that made her heart race. There, at the entrance to the tunnel where it had all happened, was a small pile of objects. Pine cones arranged in a circle, with bright red berries in the center, and on top of it all, a single bear claw. Not torn or broken, but naturally shed, the way they sometimes were. She knew immediately what it was, a thank you, a gift, a sign that what had happened was real and remembered. She picked up the claw, smooth and curved and surprisingly light, and showed it to Jacob. He took it in his small hand and held it up to the light, making that musical humming sound again. She kept the claw, wrapped it carefully in soft cloth, and put it in a box with other precious memories from Jacob's first year. But she knew it was more than just a memento. It was a reminder that the world was far more mysterious and connected than most people realized. It was proof that bravery didn't always mean being fearless. Sometimes it meant following your instinct to help, even when you didn't fully understand what was happening. Most of all, it was a symbol of the bridge that Jacob had somehow built between two worlds, a bridge made not of words or logic, but of pure, innocent compassion. As the weeks turned to months, she watched Jacob grow and develop. always looking for signs of that special quality she had witnessed in the tunnel. And it was there, in the way he approached the world with open curiosity and kindness, in the way animals always seemed drawn to him, in the way he could calm any creature with his presence. She started researching, reading everything she could find about human-animal communication, about the bonds that could form across species barriers. She found stories, so many stories, of children who seemed to have a special connection with animals, but none quite like what she had witnessed. Most were about domesticated animals, or happened over time with repeated contact. What Jacob had done was immediate, instinctive, and with a wild creature that should have been dangerous. She wondered if it was something he would keep as he grew older, or if it would fade as he learned to talk and think in human ways. Part of her hoped it would stay, that he would always have this gift. But another part worried about what it might mean for him to be different in such a fundamental way. 3 months after the incident, something else happened that convinced her the connection was permanent. They were at the playground again, Jacob now walking unsteadily on his chubby legs, when a woman approached them with a small child about Jacob's age. The woman looked exhausted and worried, and she was carrying a pet carrier with a clearly distressed cat inside. She explained that they were moving, and the cat had been traumatized by all the changes. It hadn't eaten in 2 days and wouldn't let anyone near it, not even the vet they had taken it to. She was at the park trying to calm her daughter down, who was upset about the cat. Without thinking, she found herself offering to let Jacob try. The woman looked skeptical but desperate enough to agree. She set the carrier down and opened it, warning them to be careful as the cat had been scratching and biting. Jacob toddled over to the carrier and sat down in front of it with a soft thump. He didn't reach in or make any sudden movements. He just sat there, making soft sounds that weren't quite words but seemed to have meaning. The cat, a large orange tabby with wild eyes, stopped yowling and focused on Jacob. They stared at each other for what felt like forever but was probably only a minute or two. Then Jacob slowly extended his hand, palm up, and waited. The cat crept forward, sniffed his hand, then rubbed its head against his fingers. Within minutes, it was purring, and it climbed into Jacob's lap, where it curled up as if it had known him all its life. The woman was speechless, tears streaming down her face as she watched her pet finally relax. She stayed for an hour, letting the cat rest with Jacob while her daughter played nearby, and when they finally left, the cat was calm enough to eat the treats she offered it. Word spread, the way word does in small communities. People started bringing their anxious pets to the park, hoping to encounter Jacob and his mother. She tried to discourage it at first, worried about exploiting whatever gift Jacob had. But when she saw how much it helped, both the animals and their humans, she couldn't bring herself to say no entirely. They started coming to the park at different times, trying to avoid becoming a spectacle. But somehow, the people who really needed help always seemed to find them anyway. There was the elderly man whose dog hadn't walked since his wife died, the teenage girl whose horse wouldn't let anyone ride it after an accident, the family whose parrot had stopped talking after a trauma. Jacob helped them all. Not by doing anything special that anyone could see, just by being present and making his soft sounds and somehow bridging the gap between human and animal understanding. But she never forgot that first encounter with the bear cub. Sometimes, on very quiet mornings, she thought she could see shadows moving at the edge of the woods, watching them. Once, she found fresh bear tracks near the playground, circling the area but never coming too close. And occasionally, very occasionally, Jacob would stop whatever he was doing and look toward the forest with that same intense focus, making his musical humming sound. She knew they were out there, the mother and cub, living their wild lives but remembering. The claw she had kept seemed to warm sometimes when she held it, though she knew that was probably her imagination. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe in a world where a baby could save a bear cub and communicate without words, anything was possible. As Jacob's first birthday approached, she decided to return to the tunnel on the anniversary of that morning. She brought Jacob early, when the mist was thick and the world was quiet, just like before. They sat by the tunnel, and she told him the story of what had happened, even though he was too young to understand the words. But maybe he didn't need words. Maybe he remembered in his own way. As she finished the story, a sound came from the woods, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It was that same chuffing sound the mother bear had made, a greeting across the space between worlds. Jacob stood up on his unsteady legs and waved toward the sound, babbling happily. And there, just for a moment at the edge of the trees, she saw them. Larger now, the cub, healthy and strong beside its mother. They didn't come closer, didn't need to. The acknowledgement was enough. The reminder that some connections transcend species and logic and fear. The playground had become sacred space for her, a place where the ordinary world touched something larger and more mysterious. Every time she brought Jacob there, she remembered that morning and what it had taught her about bravery and compassion and the unexpected bridges that could be built between worlds. She had started writing it all down, keeping a journal of Jacob's encounters and the changes she observed in him. Maybe someday, when he was older, she would show it to him. Maybe it would help him understand this gift he carried. Or maybe he already understood it better than she ever could, in that wordless way that children and animals shared. The journal grew thicker as the months passed, filled with stories that seemed impossible, but were absolutely true. One day, she knew, Jacob would grow up, and the world would try to teach him that what he could do was impossible. People would tell him that animals were just animals, that real communication required words, that the boundaries between species were fixed and unchangeable. But she would have the journal, and the claw, and the memories to remind him that he had once known better. She would tell him about the morning he saved a bear cub, not with strength or size, but with the pure intention to help. She would remind him that bravery wasn't about not being afraid. It was about doing what was right, even when you didn't fully understand what was happening. Most importantly, she would tell him that the world was full of mysteries and connections that most people never noticed, but that he had been given the gift of seeing and being part of them. The story of Jacob and the bear cubs spread quietly through their town, becoming one of those local legends that people weren't sure whether to believe. Some dismissed it as a mother's exaggeration. Others wondered if there was something special about that playground. But for those who had seen Jacob with their own troubled animals, who had witnessed the calm that came over creatures in his presence, the story rang true. He became known as the child who could talk to animals, though talking wasn't really what he did. It was something deeper, more fundamental, a recognition between souls that didn't need language. And if you're wondering whether such things are really possible, whether a baby could really save a bear cub and forge a connection across species, well, maybe that's not the right question to ask. Maybe the question is whether we're willing to see the magic that exists in the world, the connections that bind all living things, the bravery that comes from pure compassion. As she pushed Jacob home that anniversary morning, the sun finally breaking through the mist and warming their faces, she thought about all the mornings to come, all the animals they would meet, all the connections Jacob would make, all the bridges he would build between worlds. She thought about the bear cub, growing strong in the forest, carrying its own memory of the strange, small human who had helped it. She thought about the mother bear, fierce and protective, who had recognized a kindness in them and responded with her own. And she thought about Jacob, her remarkable son, who had shown her that the world was so much more than what it seemed on the surface. The morning had started like any other, but it had become a doorway into wonder, and that, she realized, was the real gift. Not just Jacob's ability, but the reminder that wonder existed, that connections could be made in the most unexpected ways, that bravery sometimes looked like a baby crawling toward danger with nothing but the intention to help. By the time they reached home, Jacob was asleep in the stroller, his face peaceful and content. She carefully lifted him out and carried him inside, laying him in his crib with the same gentleness she had seen him show to every creature he met. As she watched him sleep, she made a promise to herself and to him. She would protect this gift he had, nurture it, and help him understand it as he grew. She would make sure he knew that what made him different also made him special. And she would never let him forget that morning in the tunnel, when he had shown more courage than most people show in a lifetime, because that's what it had been, she realized now. Not just an encounter with a bear cub, but a moment of pure courage, the kind that comes from a heart that hasn't yet learned to be afraid of differences, that sees another being in trouble and simply acts to help. The sun climbed higher, filling their home with golden light, and somewhere in the distance she could hear birds singing. Their songs seemed different now, more meaningful, as if they were telling their own version of the story, and maybe they were. Maybe the whole natural world knew what had happened in that tunnel, recognized Jacob as a friend and protector. It was a fanciful thought, but after what she had witnessed, she was no longer quick to dismiss fanciful thoughts. The world was bigger and more connected than she had ever imagined, and her son had shown her the way into that larger world. As she started preparing his birthday celebration, she couldn't help but smile at how much had changed in a year. A year ago, she had been just another mother taking her baby to the park. Now, she was the guardian of a child who could bridge worlds, who could show others that the boundaries we think exist are often just illusions. The afternoon brought visitors, friends who had heard the stories and wanted to see Jacob for themselves. Some brought their pets, hoping for help with various problems. She had learned to manage these requests carefully, never forcing Jacob to interact, but allowing him to approach the animals if he chose to. He usually did, toddling over with his characteristic focus and sitting near them until something shifted in their energy. It never looked like much from the outside, just a baby sitting near an animal, making soft sounds. But the results spoke for themselves. Aggressive dogs became gentle, anxious cats relaxed. Even a particularly ornery parrot started singing after spending time with Jacob. Each encounter added another page to her journal, another piece of evidence that what Jacob could do was real and remarkable. But it wasn't just about the animals anymore. She had started noticing that Jacob had the same effect on people. Stressed parents relaxed around him. Crying children stopped to watch him with wonder. Even the grumpiest of neighbors smiled when they saw him. It was as if he radiated a kind of peace that affected everyone and everything around him. She wondered sometimes if the bear cub incident had awakened something in him, or if he had always carried this gift and the cub had simply been the first to recognize it. Either way, she felt privileged to witness it, to be part of this unfolding mystery. As the day wore on and the visitors left, she found herself back at the window, looking toward the park where it had all started. The playground was visible from their house if you knew where to look, just a splash of bright colors among the green of the trees. She could see the yellow and green of the tunnel, and for a moment she imagined she could see through time to that morning, see herself frozen with fear as Jacob crawled toward danger, see the moment when fear transformed into wonder. If she could go back, would she stop him? Now, knowing what she knew, she didn't think so. Some moments were meant to happen. Some connections were meant to be made, even if they defied logic and expectation. Jacob had known something she hadn't, had recognized a soul in need and responded with pure compassion. That was his gift. Not just the ability to calm animals, but the ability to see past the surface to the need beneath. That night, as she tucked Jacob into bed, he looked up at her with those wise eyes that seemed too knowing for a 1-year-old. He reached up and touched her face, making one of his soft sounds, and she felt the same calm wash over her that she had seen affect so many others. In that moment, she understood something profound. Jacob's gift wasn't separate from him, something he did or used. It was who he was, fundamental to his being. He didn't communicate with animals because he had learned how. He did it because he hadn't learned not to. He hadn't built barriers between himself and other living things, hadn't learned to see them as other or different. To him, all life was connected. All beings were worthy of compassion and understanding. The bear cub hadn't been a wild animal to him, just another being that needed help. As she left his room, she paused at the door to look back at him one more time. He was already asleep, one hand stretched out as if reaching for something in his dreams. She wondered what he dreamed about. If he dreamed of running through forests with bears, of flying with birds, of swimming with fish. Or maybe his dreams were even more wonderful than that, filled with connections and communications that she couldn't even imagine. She closed the door softly and went to her own room, where she took out the bear claw and held it up to the moonlight streaming through the window. It seemed to glow softly, though that might have been her imagination. Or maybe not. Maybe some objects carried the memory of profound moments, became talismans of connection and courage. She thought about the mother bear somewhere in the forest, perhaps telling her own version of the story to her cub. Did bears have ways of passing down important memories? Did the cub remember the small human who had freed it? She liked to think so, liked to imagine that somewhere in the woods, their story was being preserved in whatever way bears preserved important things. Maybe in scent marks that told of human kindness, maybe in paths that carefully skirted the playground in respect, maybe in some way that humans couldn't understand, but that was no less real for being unknown. The thought comforted her, the idea that their story existed in multiple versions, told in different languages across species barriers. A year later, on Jacob's second birthday, something extraordinary happened. They were at the playground for their morning visit when Jacob suddenly stood very still, his head tilted as if listening to something. Then he started walking, not toward the tunnel but toward the woods. She followed, her heart beating fast with a mixture of worry and anticipation. At the edge of the trees, he stopped and sat down, patting the ground beside him in clear invitation for her to join him. She sat, and they waited. The morning was perfect, clear and cool with birds singing all around them. Then, moving so quietly she almost didn't hear them, they came. The mother bear and her cub, now much larger but still recognizable. They stopped about 20 feet away, far enough to be safe but close enough to really see each other. The cub, now an adolescent, looked at Jacob with what she could only describe as recognition. It made a soft sound, and Jacob responded with his musical hum. They sat like that for maybe 5 minutes, two species acknowledging each other across the divide of wildness and civilization. Then the mother bear did something that took her breath away. She nudged her cub forward, just a step or two, and the young bear carefully placed something on the ground before retreating to its mother's side. They turned and melted back into the forest, leaving their gift behind. When she was sure they were gone, she and Jacob went to see what they had left. It was a piece of honeycomb, still dripping with golden honey, placed on a large leaf. Jacob clapped his hands in delight and looked up at her with shining eyes. She understood then that this wasn't an ending but a continuation. The connection Jacob had forged that morning in the tunnel wasn't a single moment, but an ongoing relationship, one that transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild. It was a reminder that bravery created bonds that lasted, that compassion was a language understood by all living things, that the world was full of magic for those who knew how to see it. She carefully picked up the honeycomb, wrapping it in the leaf, and they carried it home together. That night, they shared the honey, the sweetest she had ever tasted, and she told Jacob the story again of the morning he saved a bear cub. He listened with that intense focus, and when she finished, he said his first clear word, "Friend." And that's what they were, she realized. Friends across species, connected by an act of bravery and kindness that had changed all their lives forever. The story could end there, with honey and friendship and the promise of continued connection. But life doesn't really end. It just continues in ways we don't always expect. Jacob grew, as children do, but he never lost his gift. If anything, it grew stronger as he learned to combine his intuitive understanding with human language and reasoning. By the time he was 5, people came from neighboring towns to seek his help with troubled animals. By 10, he was working with wildlife rehabilitators, able to calm injured wild animals enough for treatment. By 15, he had started writing his own journal, documenting not just his encounters but his theories about interspecies communication. He never forgot the bear cub, and every year on the anniversary of that first meeting, he and his mother would go to the playground at dawn and wait. Sometimes they saw shadows in the forest. Sometimes they found gifts. Sometimes there was just the peaceful feeling of being remembered. But perhaps the most important part of the story isn't about Jacob's gift or even about the bears. It's about what that morning taught everyone who heard about it. It taught that bravery doesn't always roar. Sometimes it crawls forward on chubby baby hands. It taught that connection is possible between the most unlikely beings. It taught that the world is full of magic and mystery, waiting for those brave enough to reach out their hands in help. Most of all, it taught that a single moment of pure compassion can ripple outward, touching lives in ways we never imagined. The bear cub grew up strong and healthy, living its wild life but carrying the memory of human kindness. Jacob grew up knowing that the boundaries between species were more fluid than most people believed. His mother grew old, treasuring the memory of the morning. Her baby showed her what true bravery looked like. And the tunnel? It still stands in the playground, yellow and green and ordinary looking. But if you know the story, if you look closely on misty mornings, you might see something special about it. A certain glow, maybe, or the way animals seem drawn to it. Children play in it every day, crawling through with laughter and joy, not knowing that they're passing through a place where something extraordinary happened. Or maybe they do know, in the way children know things without being told. Maybe that's why they love it so much, why they always pause for just a moment in the middle, as if listening for something. And maybe, just maybe, if they're very lucky and very brave and full of compassion, they might hear it too, the echo of a baby's musical hum and a bear cub's grateful response, the sound of two worlds touching in a moment of perfect understanding. The years passed, and the story became legend in their small town. Some believed it completely, others thought it was exaggerated, and still others dismissed it entirely. But for those who had witnessed Jacob's gift firsthand, who had seen him calm a panicked horse or soothe a traumatized dog, the story of the bear cub rang with absolute truth. It became a touchstone for the community, a reminder that extraordinary things could happen in ordinary places, that their small town had been the site of something magical. Parents brought their children to the playground and told them the story, hoping to inspire them to be brave and kind. Some claimed that playing in the tunnel made their children more empathetic, more connected to nature. Whether that was true or just wishful thinking didn't really matter. What mattered was that the story lived on, inspiring acts of kindness and bravery in its retelling. Jacob himself grew into a quiet, thoughtful young man who never sought fame or attention for his gift. He studied veterinary medicine and animal behavior, combining his intuitive understanding with scientific knowledge. He opened a practice in the same town where it all began, a place where traditional veterinary care merged with something harder to define. Animals that other vets couldn't help found healing in his presence. Aggressive dogs became gentle, traumatized cats learned to trust again, injured wildlife recovered faster than anyone expected. He never claimed to do anything special, always credited the animals themselves for their recovery. But those who watched him work saw the same quality that had been present in that baby crawling through the tunnel: an absolute absence of fear and an abundance of compassion. His mother lived to see him graduate, to see him open his practice, to see him help hundreds of animals and their humans. She kept the journal and the bear claw safe, passing them on to him when he was ready. He read through her careful documentation of his early years with wonder and gratitude, seeing his childhood through her eyes. The bear claw sat on his desk, a constant reminder of where his journey had begun. And every year, on that anniversary morning, he would go to the playground alone and sit by the tunnel. Sometimes he sensed them out there, the descendants of those first bears, living their wild lives but carrying forward the memory of connection. Once, just once, he found another gift, a perfect feather that could only have been placed deliberately. He knew then that the story continued, passed down in ways he couldn't fully understand through generations of forest creatures. The playground itself became a kind of pilgrimage site for people who had heard the story. They came hoping to feel something special, to witness their own miracle. Most left disappointed, seeing only ordinary playground equipment and feeling nothing unusual. But occasionally, very occasionally, someone would have an encounter that reminded them that the world was bigger and more mysterious than they had believed. A child might befriend a usually shy squirrel, or a worried parent might find unexpected peace sitting by the tunnel. These small moments kept the story alive, kept people believing that connection across difference was possible. The tunnel was eventually replaced when the playground was renovated, but the community insisted that the new one be painted the same yellow and green, placed in the exact same spot. Some things were too important to change. As for whether such things are really possible, whether a baby could really communicate with a bear cub and forge a lasting connection, well, that depends on what you believe about the world. If you believe that consciousness is limited to humans, that animals are merely instinct-driven creatures without real awareness, then the story is just a fantasy. But if you believe that consciousness exists in many forms, that communication can happen without words, that compassion is a universal language, then maybe the story is not only possible, but inevitable. Maybe there are Jacobs everywhere, children who haven't yet learned that such connections are impossible, who reach out with pure hearts and find response. Maybe the only difference is that most of these moments happen in private, unwitnessed and unrecorded. The scientific community would say that what happened was a series of coincidences and anthropomorphic projections. The bear cub was simply stuck. Jacob happened to help free it, and everything else was imagination and wishful thinking. But science doesn't explain everything, especially when it comes to consciousness and connection. There are too many stories, too many witnesses to unusual bonds between humans and animals, to dismiss them all as fantasy. And for those who have experienced such connections firsthand, no amount of scientific skepticism can erase the knowledge of what they've felt. Jacob knew what he had experienced was real. His mother knew it. And in their own way, the bears knew it too. That knowing was enough, more than enough to build a life upon. The deeper truth of the story might be this: that bravery isn't about being fearless, it's about acting from love even in the presence of fear. Jacob hadn't been brave because he didn't understand danger. He had been brave because something in him recognized a being in need and responded without hesitation. That kind of bravery is available to all of us. If we can quiet our fears long enough to hear the call for help. It doesn't require special gifts or abilities, just the willingness to see past surface differences to the common ground beneath. The bear cub had been different from Jacob in every obvious way: size, species, wildness, danger. But in the moment of their meeting, those differences had dissolved, leaving only two young beings recognizing each other. This is what Jacob's story teaches us: that the boundaries we perceive between ourselves and others, especially other species, are often more mental than real. We build these boundaries for safety, for understanding, for categorization. But life itself doesn't recognize these boundaries. Life flows between and through all living things, connecting us in ways we're only beginning to understand. When we act from that place of connection, when we respond to need without first calculating risk and reward, we tap into something profound and transformative. We become bridges between worlds, translators of the universal language of compassion. And in doing so, we don't just help others, we discover who we really are beneath our fears and limitations. The story spreads still, passed from parent to child, shared in quiet moments when the world seems too harsh and divided. It reminds people that gentleness can be a form of strength, that the smallest among us can be the bravest, that connection is possible even across seemingly impossible divides. In a world that often seems fractured and hostile, the story of Jacob and the bear cub offers a different vision. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, we're all more connected than we think. Maybe the walls between us are thinner than they appear. Maybe all it takes is one brave soul, even a baby, to show us the way through to each other. And maybe that's the real magic, not that a baby saved a bear cub, but that in doing so, he reminded us all of what's possible when we lead with love instead of fear.